for including our paper to this amazing conference. This paper, today I'm very happy to talk about this paper called The Impact of AI and Cross-Border Data Regulations on International Trade in Digital Services. This paper is co-authored with Dan Trefler and I'm Ruiqi Sun. The digital services has become the fast-growing component of international trade, and the dynamic part is the services in mobile apps. And here are some facts about trade in mobile apps. So first, the revenue of mobile app sector has grown so rapidly and tripled since 2016 to 2020, and reached 465 in 2022. So the primary monetization model of the sector is when digital advertisement, which steadily account for 70% of the revenue during those years. And unlike the manufacturing sector, mobile app services expansion is highly globalized. In this figure, we plot the cumulative distribution of the foreign market share measured by the number of foreign users over total users for all apps and small apps only. So we can see that a medium app its market share is greater than 90%. This is an impressively high number, and it's also true for the superstar apps like YouTube and Facebook. Those foreign market share for Chinese apps are relatively lower, but still for TikTok, which located just below the 20th percentile, more than half of users is outside China. Okay. And also, these mobile apps as one type of software are usually powered by data and AI algorithms. The developers tend to use AI improve the user's experience and keep the user stay longer on the app. Those screening time can be monetized when sending the digital advertisements. Some examples like the recommenders in TikTok, the first deep learning translator in Google Translation, and also the AI generated content in the popular games. Okay, this has caught the attention of the public and also the policymakers. Yet there are still major disagreements internationally about how to regulate cross-border data flows. There are some anti-regulation initiatives in the chapter of digital trade under the trade agreements, but still there are a lot of pro-regulation initiatives, such as famous EU's GDPR, California's CCPA, and China's very strict data security law. So based on all those facts, it shows that the mobile app sector actually provides us a highly relevant setting backed by readily available data for studying AI, data trade, and data policies. We believe that this research topic is a timely research question that engaged the economists more in the current policy making in digital sector. So in this paper, we're going to using the context of mobile apps to study two research questions. First, does AI has causal effect on international trade? Here, AI, we mean AI algorithms. And second, do regulations on cross-border data flows limit the effectiveness of AI algorithms? In addition, methodology-wise, we're going to tackle a hard question in the empirical trade literature, that is to link the technologies to individual product in the presence of multi-product firms. And here we're going to apply a large language model to textuate the textual data and study this question. Okay, here is a preview of what we do and what we found. First, we try to measure the AI deployed in mobile apps. Theoretically, we provide a conceptual model where AI serves primarily as a quality shifter at product level. Then from this model, we can derive our empirical specifications, address the potential endogenous concerns, and illustrate our identification strategy. And I have to make it clear that you can think this identification strategy is a diff type of instrumental variable So all the magnitude I showed should be interpreted as a relative change rather than the absolute value. A related caveat is that we don't have a welfare statement at the level, but that is in our work in progress. And also, we use the large language model to measure the AI deployment at product level. Here we use the cosine similarities between the embeddings of app descriptions and patent abstract to measure the connectiveness of AI patterns and app functions. Based on this data and empirical model, we find that AI has causally increased international trade in mobile apps by a factor of 3.5. However, this increase is more than halved by cross-border data regulations in those markets with strict data restrictions. Okay, this paper fit in the small but growing literature about AI's impact on trade. There are some previous empirical paper study one type of AI technologies, such as translators or AI surveillance. But here we try to tackle a broad class of AI algorithms, and we have been working on this topic for a long time. So there are some previous old works about it. Also, it speaks to the digital regulations. Most of existing paper about privacy concerns. And here we're going to study the cross-border data regulations, which could potentially discriminative to the foreign companies. Also, the theoretical part is based on Costa's pioneer work about penetration cost in trade. And we're going to use that spirit to rationalize the monetization through digital advertisement as one type of market penetration cost. Also, it's broadly related to the literature about internet and trade, including e-commerce, and our discussant Maggie also have been working on this for a long time. So that's all about the big picture of this project. And next, I'm going to talk more in details about the data and measurements. Our primary data set is from an app intelligence company called Sensor Tower. From here, we have a very comprehensive coverage of apps from App Store and Google Play in the period of 2015 to 2020. We use the number of monthly active users as a measure of apps usage by app and market. Those apps are produced from 59 exporters, and we have the usage in 84 importing countries. Those apps are linked with app developers, and we manually match the app developers to the firms in the Orbis database. So in the end, we successfully matched the top 1,300 firms, which are linked with around 1,300 apps and owns around 64,000 AI patents. And we took a close look at the patenting file of those patents, and most of them are about AI algorithms and AI softwares. So this actually is contract with a common prior that AI algorithms are open sourced and never been patented, but that's not the case. Here we plot the majority of these AI patents are using the modern deep learning techniques, and we're plotting the deep learning patents applications from 2000 to 2020. Here, I would like to highlight 3 dates. So in 2008, mobile apps are first appeared to the market when the first smartphone launched to the US. And before that, there's no even the concept of mobile app. And it's widely recognized that the first commercialization of AI started in 2012, and the first application on mobile app started in 2016. And the rise of deep learning patterns in our database also start around 2016. So this suggests that the application of AI patterns is associated with the commercialization on mobile apps. And before that, we think that's all some fundamental researches and for general purpose AI patterns that are not target for mobile app. Okay, so here is a challenging question as it appeared in many of the empirical trade literature that we only observe the ownership of patents and the product, and we do not observe the adoption within a firm. And the key here is that we have very rich detailed product and descriptions from the app side. However, the descriptions of the app and patent abstract are very distinct textual data. One is consumer-facing, and another is more like for legitimacy. So the traditional textual analysis approach may fail to answer this question, such as counts for the keywords, because these two type of data are using very different languages. And here, our solution is to use the modern large language model to make a linkage between this type of data. When we start this project in 2019, there's no OpenAI and no ChatGPT, so we spent quite a time to explain these terminologies, but now I hope you are not getting tired of hearing about this. So what we use is Google's most advanced large language model called BERT. The T represents a transformer. It extracts the features from textual data and decodes them as text embeddings. The embeddings are unit vectors with a fixed length, which is determined by the underlying model. The large language model is pre-trained on massive data with a huge scale of the parameters. So the two embeddings pointing at similar places in the corpus space, meaning it represents similar subjects. Okay. The embedding itself has no meaning outside of the model, but the relative distance between the two matters to interpret the content of the text. Yes? No. Yeah, exactly. We don't have enough computation power to like fine tuning the data, but instead we just keep updating and modifying our prompts to direct the model to with the same weights. And theoretically, this computer scientist paper shows these two are potentially equivalent if we have efficient good prompts. Thanks. Okay. In this exercise, we use A denote the FA and P denote the patent P. And the rho AP is a cosine similarity between the textual description and textual abstract. Let F represent the firm that owns app A, and capital PAT represents all patents owned by the app developer and filed between 1992 up to the year T. So the AI deployment for app A at year T is the summation of all the rho APs across patents in the set P. Okay, so besides the traditional measure as the count of patent numbers, there is sort of an intensive measure as the average directness of app to all these AI patents. Okay, you can also interpret it as a weighted summation of patents where the weight is the connectiveness rather than the traditional one, such as the citations. Okay. Of course, we are proposing this new methodology to link the data and make the prediction of AI deployment. So we need some validation of this test. Ideally, if we observe the ground truth of AI deployment at the product level, we can verify our approach. But this is really hard and most of the time unobservable. So here, for a small set of apps in the photography and video category, those apps need to run the deep learning, some deep learning functions offline on your devices, such as facial recognitions. And for those ones, they have to embody their AI or deep learning framework on the mobile devices with the lines of codes. So we do a re-engineering on those code and detect the AI-related frameworks. And we do find that the apps with the higher AI deployment measured in our variable also have a high probability to be detected with deep learning frameworks. Okay. And for other related exercise, we have more ground truths, where is the prediction for categories. So here, we're selecting the top 50 apps from the social networking apps and use the pairwise app similarities to predict whether these apps have the similar functions. And from this figure, you can see that WhatsApp is more similar with Messenger, WeChat, Line, Kakao, and so on, but significantly different from other social networking apps such as Mailbox. And the pairwise similarity of diagonal blocks, such as WhatsApp with Gmail, is never in the highest decile measured by the pairwise similarities. So both of these validation tests prove that actually the textual data is informative about what this app and the patterns are about, and it can help us to make these predictions when the underlying ground truth is not observable. Okay. With this data in hand, we're going to propose a specification and estimate the effect. So first, I'm going to present a very parsimonious model, and this is for the purpose to motivate empirical specification. The demand of the consumer is quite standard. The demand for physical goods is just from Costa's JPE paper, and the consumers have logic demand for the apps. Consumer chooses one or no apps from a given category C. The apps are supplied by the firms with heterogeneous quality. There are two components of the firm quality. The first, theta A is the exogenous idiosyncratic draw. This is Malistef for the quality shifter. And alpha A is a multiplier from endogenous AI investment. Okay, and from the model, we can derive the optimal AI development as this equation shows. So there are three determinants. The first part, WIA, represents the cost of hiring AI scientists. This WA is to the first part is WA to a power of 1 minus eta C. So that power measures sort of the AI intensity and reflect how effective the C type of app to use AI in improving the experience of the users. Okay, and the second part is the unobserved quality shifter, which generally governs all the scaling effect at product level. And the third part is a price aggregator that governs the demand from the market. Okay, just like all the trade models, we can log linearize the expression of trade shares and rate it as our estimating equations. On the left-hand side, our dependent variable is number of active users for app A from category C and in market N. It's a function of product A's AI deployment plus a reduced from the fixed effect capturing all the market size effect for country N. And also, the unobserved quality shift here is loaded to the structural error terms. Okay, in the estimation, we're going to measure the AI AI investment in the model by ln 1 plus AI weighted summation of the patterns described before. Okay, so obviously there's an endogeneity concerns of AI deployment both for the omitted variable and for the reverse causality concerns, because the AI deployment is a function of the unobserved product characteristic delta A. And here we kind of following the spirit of Hatch-Olin model and to construct an exogenous cost shifter from the supply side of the AI, which is orthogonal to the demand side, but only change the first part. That is the AI intensity of type C times AI abundance, which governs the cost of developing AI. Okay. But we're going to do that in a quite non-parametric way. So roughly speaking, we're going to use the similar app's AI as an instrumental variable for app A's own AI. And we're going to do that in the following steps. First, we divide countries into 6 bins by their AI abundance relative to capital abundance. And within each country, we divide the firms further into 2 bins based on their AI status back in 2008. We assume that for apps with positive AI back in 2008, they have some early exposure to AI, but those are not for a mobile app per se. Then we get 2 times 6 bins by firm and country, and we are going to only consider apps within each bin. Okay, for an app within a given bin, we can calculate all the cosine similarities between any 2 apps and pick key apps with the highest similarity. Those are the closest neighbors to a given app A. And we define this as the set of the neighbors. The instrumental variable is simply given by zeta, which is a function of ln 1 plus the average AI deployment across the k closest neighbors. Okay, we assume that their AI deployment is independent of the unobservable quality for app A, and we are going to verify that empirically. Okay, so that is our empirical model, and we are going to bring the data to the model. This is some specification. The dependent variable is number of active users for app A in year T. Here we focus on the A level. And the main explanatory variable is ln 1 plus AI deployment. In all specification, we're going to include as many as possible the observable characteristic at the product level, including the age, downloading price. Dummy indicates whether this app supports in-app purchase and displaying ads. And in our baseline results, we use average across the top 3 nearest neighbor as instrument, but the results are robust across 1 to 5 nearest neighbors. Okay, so this is the first OLS results. I'm going to be very brief for interpreting all the results. So all the explanatory variable and control variables are scaled by 1 interquartile range. So the magnitude of the coefficients are comparable. So first, we can see that all the coefficient on AI is positive and significant. We use 1 star to indicate significance at 1% level, not 10% level. And the magnitude are quite robust across different specifications with different bunch of controls and fixed effects. But let's focus on the IV estimates. So first, the IV estimates estimated coefficients are slightly smaller than OLS ones. And in our baseline, indicated by column 4, we control the first fixed effect and category exporter year fixed effects. The coefficient is 1.26, meaning one interquartile range increase in AI deployment increased the total number of users worldwide by 1.26 log points, which is equivalent to 3.5-fold increase. This is a large number. And interestingly, we also include non-AI patterns and a number of undirected AI measured as the summation of 1 minus rho AP across all the patterns at the control variable. All the coefficients are negative and relatively small compared to the AI variable, meaning there could be potentially a competition for research and development resources within the firm, which lead to the negative coefficients of the two. Okay. And then we have a bunch of robustness and the discussion for the mechanism. First, we find that AI indeed helps to create new products. Here we plot the distribution of the most similar competitors among all the apps for AI patterns and patterns with for AI apps and non-AI apps separately. And we find that compared with non-AI apps are less similar with their closest competitors. So this sort of create the local block of the competition. Yes. And second, to illustrate the role of this directness, which is an innovative part in our measurement, we do a placebo test by randomizing the rho AP across all these peers. So we still allow the number of patterns play a role in this specification. But here, the estimated coefficients, this is IV estimates coefficients. It shrinks from 1.26 to only 0.2. Okay, so without this intensive measures, we can get a very different results. Third, the underlying assumptions for our instrument variable is that this unobserved quality shifter should be orthogonal with our instrument variable zeta. So here we use the ratings of the app as a proxy for quality, and we find that it indeed correlated with its own trait and with its own AI deployment, but independent with our instrument variable. So this provide further evidence that validate our instrument variable approach. Okay, so far, yes. Sure.
Download all the applications, so the number of users technically is going up, but at the end of the day, people pretty much spend all the time in just one application as opposed to many. So if one want to look at actual use in terms of time as opposed to how many users are registered,
yes,
the whole pattern or phenomenon may be interpreted differently.
Yes, that's a great question. So actually in the data, we try different measures such as the number of downloads, active users, and also the time spent. But due to the data availability, we only have that for 1 year. Here we kind of look at a long time horizon, but for that 1 year period, these two are highly correlated. So with more data in the future, we're very interested to run that with the different measurements. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so far all the results are showed at the product level, and next we're going to turn to the bilateral structure of the trade and investigate the impact of cross-border data regulations on AI. So first, we think it's really an urgent and timely research questions because there now is a global debate on how to regulate data. China, US, and EU countries have very different opinions on how to do that. And even within each country, there are a debate on that. So for example, GDPR as a representative feature of the Brussels effect, it might come to an end because it's now seen as a as an example of over-regulation, which limited the innovation of the firms. And also, the governor in California just turned down the terms under CCPA, which regulate how the AI firms should use the data and the release of large language models. Also, after the case of Didi and TikTok in the US, China said now completely prohibit the cross-border data regulation, the data transactions. So there's increased tensions between data regulations and innovation competition, and we're going to provide some empirical evidence about that. Okay, so the restrictions on cross-border data flows is measured using OECD's data called Digital Service Trade Restrictiveness Index. It covers the period from 2014 to 2022. And thanks for the economists from OECD, we have disaggregated numbers for different terms. And we use that to construct two types of restrictions. The first term is about data flow restrictions that are the limitations on cross-border data flows. And the second are about data generations, meaning those restrictions limit the local performance that are required to support the cross-border digital flows, such as downloading, streaming, and displaying online advertisements. Okay, the question here is, how do country N's cross-border data regulations limit the effectiveness of AI for apps used in market N? So here, the dependent variable now is a bilateral trade flow by app A in market N and year T. So besides this previous independent variable, we include another interaction of the data regulations times AI deployment. So we are now interested in estimated theta, which is the data's impact on the marginal effect of AI. Yes?
Sorry, this could be different by country. Is this the N is the country?
Yeah.
Including a regulation by country.
Yes, yes, exactly.
But you don't get, maybe the theta is different by country.
Sorry, what is different?
Theta.
Theta? Oh, yeah. That's possible, but we don't have that. Yep. Okay. Yep. So here we display the estimated results in two ways. We include those two restrictions separately and aggregate into one index and interact with AI in column 1 and 2. So first, all these the coefficients are negative and significance, meaning that the data restrictions lower the impact, the marginal effect of AI in these countries with higher restrictions. And how to interpret the magnitude? So here, for a country with high level of restrictiveness in data, such as China and EU countries, its cross-border data flow restrictions lower AI's impact on trade by more than a half, compared with a country without any restrictions, such as US and Canada. This is equivalent to the effect of lower the impact from 3.5 factor to only 1.6 folder. So this is a significant effect. And because this AI restrictiveness is essentially a characteristic of the importers, so we might think it may pick up the other characteristics from the importer side. So here we add actual interactions with other observables, such as the GDP per capita, the democracy score, and AI abundance. Including all these factors doesn't really affect the magnitude and the significance of our main explanatory variables. So the results are robust with other characteristics. Okay, so let me conclude. In this paper, we studied the impact on digital services trade on AI both for algorithm and data. We find that AI algorithm causally increase the international trade in mobile app services by 1.26 log point or 3.5-folder, but this increase is more than halved by the restrictions on cross-border data flows. But as I said, we have a caveat that we do not have a clear welfare statement because this all relative to the non-AI apps. So in our research pipelines, we would like to investigate more about welfare, externalities, national security concerns, or privacies, and so on. Yes.
Yeah, so is there a way to go back and look at the impact of regulation on AI? So like if Chinese firms face a lot of regulation for selling apps abroad, then maybe they will do less innovation.
Yeah.
Innovation. I don't know if that...
Yeah, that could be. I think, yeah, that's what possibly could be done because we do observe from like 2008, the whole life cycle of all the apps appeared on the market. So we could possibly do, more about it. Yep. Thanks. Yeah, that's how I think I also stopped earlier.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, discussion by Maggie Chen.
All right, great. Thanks very much for the opportunity to read this very interesting paper. For anyone who wants to learn about AI and trade, I highly recommend you to read both this paper and the paper before that. And in fact, I would also recommend you to read Dan's earlier writings on AI and trade. So the question that I think I don't need to convince everyone is a very pressing and contemporary topic, international trade. And the paper asks two main questions. First, how does AI adoption affect cross-border data flow? And second, what is the impact of data regulation in the in AI, and also how AI affects trade? And the answers are very intuitive and striking. They find first, AI adoption tends to triple digital trade, okay? And then data regulations in the import country can have the impact of AI on trade, okay? The paper is very innovative. It is the first large-scale empirical study looking at not only the impact of AI, but also the impact of data regulations. And they have a very creative measure of AI deployment, trying to matching the app's descriptions with AI patterns using BERT, using LLM. And they this overcomes the issue of having time-varying app-specific measures of AI adoptions. The paper also has a very nice theory that leads us not only to the empirical specification, but also a theory-motivated instrument for AI deployment. The empirical results, which are very thoroughly done, offer a lot of implications for AI policy, right? It really makes me think, how can what's the best way to regulate, okay, given the concerns on privacy and national security, because there are different approaches out there. As a discussant, I think this is a very difficult paper to discuss because it's so thorough. They have really thought through all of these specifications and methodologies and instruments. So I want to take a step back and think a little bit more about the mechanisms, okay? So about the first question of the paper, how AI enables, cross-border, digital service trade. And here, the authors, Rachel and Dan, think of AI deployment as a quality shifter, right, in the model and so on. But I wonder, what are the underlying mechanisms that obviously can enhance quality of mobile apps? these mechanisms that don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? Here are three that I can think about. For example, I can, as a user of Netflix, right? Netflix has become smarter over time and always trying to predict what movies I want to watch. And I hate to say that, it does a pretty good job, by suggesting K-dramas and so on. So I think of that kind of app, AI deployment, right, as reducing search costs and enhancing matching. And I'm not just talking about matching between buyers and sellers, matching between users and businesses. I'm talking about matching between users and the content, right? And that certainly reduces my search costs. And second mechanism can be a reduction in production costs, right? And for example, you can think about the AI chatbots, right? Or the social media content moderation. They reduce the production costs, right? And replace, for example, the customer services. And the third mechanism is a reduction in transaction costs. It can be the language translation, right? It can be the mobile banking, right? These, Stopify, these apps that allow you to do transactions more easily and more swiftly. So I wonder if the analysis can explore some of these outcomes that are not currently highlighted in the paper to sort of disentangle these mechanisms a little bit, right? Because you do have data that go beyond the number of users, right? I think there was a question earlier about, what about the engagement, the depth of engagement, how much time you spend on the app, which is intensive margin, right? And what about the reviews, the ratings, which I think you also have data because you do control for that on the right-hand side, and the pricing, because I think these three mechanisms listed here can have different implications for different outcomes, right? So by looking at the impact of AI deployment on these different outcomes, you might be able to say which mechanism or which friction the AI deployment is really effective in tackling. Okay, so more specifically about the measures of AI deployment, which is very creative. I don't have a lot of good ideas to, as an alternative, but I wonder, because you're trying to match the app descriptions with the patent abstracts, and it's the patents developed by the same app developer, right? But what about mobile apps that use open source technologies, right? I don't have my own patents. I use open source technologies, or I get licenses from other patents. How do you capture that kind of AI deployment, right? Especially for the smaller mobile app writers, they probably don't have their patents, right? Would you underestimate AI deployment in that sense, right? One idea is to use perhaps the updates, these mobile apps, they do updates all the time. And if the descriptions would say anything about AI keywords, right? If they contain AI keywords, could you use that as a sort of alternative check validation to see if you can measure AI deployment that way? And then about the instrument for your AI deployment, I really like the fact that you're using the theory to motivate the supply side instrument, which is the AI deployment of nearest neighbors, right? And the nearest neighbors are defined based on the country beings, right? The origin country of the mobile app developers and the categories of the apps. But I wonder, the nearest neighbors are really representing the supply side only, right? Because when you think about Google App Suites, right? And they probably have a first mover advantage that give them more users, more downloads, even without AI deployment, right? So I just think the nearest neighbors might have some demand side similarities as well because of the uniqueness of the mobile apps, right? The HO theory is obviously great for understanding the costs, separating supply and demand. But here, the mobile apps are a little bit different, right? They have network effects, they have first mover advantage, which are absent in HO theories. So I'm not sure you can really isolate supply and demand very cleanly, Okay, so now moving on to the second part of the paper, which is the data regulations, right? And there I also want to think a bit hard about the mechanisms, right? So what kind of regulations are out there? I really like how Rachel and Dan try to categorize them to data generation regulations versus data flow regulations, right? So as a trade economist, obviously I want to think what that means for regular physical goods trade policies, right? So data generation restrictions, in my view, can be viewed as policy that affect the resources, right? It's affecting your capacity to generate data, right? Which is your resource as an app developer. And then data flow policies are those policies that try to affect the trade flows, right? So you can think of them as trade restrictions, right? And there's a third type of regulation, I believe, which probably is not there in the OECD restriction index, and that is the regulations on algorithm, right? So that kind of regulation, I think, is going to affect productivity, right? If you think of algorithm as a productivity. So I try to map them to different categories. And of course, I use AI for help, right? I asked them, can you give me examples of these policies? Now that I invented these three categories, right? And then Rachel has these two. What are the examples, right? And I think they are mostly correct, the suggested regulations for each category. But I think it's important to really differentiate these different types of restrictions because I think they have different things to say about trade and exports and imports and about domestic sales. For example, data generation and algorithm policies, I think, should affect more than trade, right? It affects your domestic capacity too, right? So if you have restrictions on how much data I can tap into, how much data I can access, it's going to affect not just how much I'm going to import from foreign apps, right? Imports of foreign apps, but also my own domestic downloads and of domestic apps. Whereas restrictions on data flow, right, that can be unilateral, which I think is the data you have don't really differentiate between unilateral versus preferential, will mainly affect imports because it's the import countries' data flow restrictions should affect imports. So if you can look at not just imports alone, as you currently do in the paper, you can also look at exports and domestic downloads, you would be able to differentiate the policies a little bit. And I think especially for the first category, data generation and algorithm policies, they can actually help us understand how data restrictions or regulations in general will shape a country's comparative advantage, right? If you're too restrictive, would that actually limit your country's capacity in developing your own, technologies, right? Okay, so about the restrictions, I'm running out of time. You are looking
From her.
I'll take over some of the time. So you are looking, I think, the last category of the DSTRI, but there's so many other categories there, right? So you don't have to read all the small fonts, but I wonder if those other categories also can have an impact on data flows and are correlated with your restrictions. And this is probably mainly about the overall, endogeneity of the restrictions you're looking at, right? How much should we worry about these other restrictions that can affect data flows? Okay, now the impact of data regulations on the role of AI. So here, I think the impact can really depend on the substitutability of other apps, right? Obviously, when you talk about substitutability, I just have to talk about the TikTok ban and the red notes, right? I don't know how many of us here use TikToks or how many of us use red notes. I do use both. So as you probably know, in January, right, in anticipation of the upcoming digital ban on TikTok, that created a phenomenon called TikTok refugees, right? In fact, my co-author and I exchanged notes on that. So millions of TikTok users became refugees and they flooded not YouTube Shorts or real, they flooded the Chinese app Red Note, which was written in Chinese for Chinese users. So instead of worrying about their data stored in Virginia, then they decided to give the data directly to Chinese app developers by signing up at the Red Note, right? So you saw this brief, massive migration of American users to the Chinese app, right? As you can see here. So I wonder if, the restrictions we have, right, if they are bilateral or even app specific, could lead to trade diversion to other apps from other countries potentially, or even backfire in this case, right? It actually backfired because, there's a lot more data flow as a result of this digital ban on TikTok, right? In fact, the Chinese kids took advantage of this by hiring American TikTok users as English tutors. And you see how language barrier played no role whatsoever. Data was able to flow in that direction despite the language barrier. And in fact, the Red Note developer enhance their AI technology in response to the digital regulation by introducing real-time translation overnight. Okay, so I just think that the restrictions if we can say more about bilateral restrictions, preferential restrictions, how that can lead to different trade patterns, that would be quite interesting as more future step of the work. All right, so just to conclude, a super timely and outstanding paper is another important contribution by the authors. And I think the fundamental message of the paper is more universal. It's not just digital trade, right? Regulations can offset the trade effect of technology. I think that applies to physical conventional trade as well. Policy questions, I think there are still some open questions we can answer, and that is, what's the sweet spot for data regulations? What are the best way to approach this? Should we think about national treatment, data agreements, international standards, and so on? So I'll stop here. Thank you.
We have already a question from Costas.
No, how do we do? Does she answer first?
She can answer, or you can ask the question.
All the questions.
Because you raised the hand.
Yeah,
it was relevant to the discussion.
No, I just forgot that.
Do you want to
was sort of-
quickly answer?
I can answer it together. How about this?
I mean, I know you have the other paper where you also look at the substitution patterns, right? But I mean, in relation to Maggie's discussion. Oh, yeah, that's right. I can think. I know you have the other paper where you look at the substitution patterns, but in relation to Maggie's question, you could potentially see how restrictions to AI will lead some innovative firms losing losing users to relevant apps. So that maybe it's kind of an interesting thing to explore and seems straightforward.
So do you want to answer to this, and then we take one question?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Maggie, for giving all these very helpful comments and help us to advertise other papers. And I do think these are really valuable comments. And just a quick response. I think in general, people are thinking about all type of externalities in the digital sector, such as Maggie mentioned, from the demand side was a search and matching mechanism, or this network effect, demand network effects, or from the supply side, this data-driven learning process, and so on. We are thinking about that. We have a separate paper about externalities, and also in bilateral sense, there is concerns or interest about cultural differences, language barriers, and bilateral trust. We also try to address it in a separate paper in a gravity model. Yes, and just as Costas mentioned, my job market paper studies the substitutability, where we have this macro foundation for pairwise substitution patterns between apps. The one reason we didn't really do much about innovation or the long run feedback because all these regulations happened very early, a bit before, even before 2008. And for the intensive measure of usage, we only have it starting from 2015, where all those innovation has already happened a long time ago. That limits our empirical ability to explain those long-run effects. So currently, we leverage primarily on the cross-sectional data variation. But we are interested to explore more in that sense. Okay, I think I basically covered all these questions, and I would like to talk more with Maggie after the conference. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Very interesting. So as they say, necessity is a mother of invention. So I wonder here, so on the one hand, you are saying that the regulations reduce the number of, transactions, maybe number of apps. But I wonder maybe the focus also should be on the quality of the apps, and maybe it actually incentivizes firms to think outside the box, and instead of like doing some cheap flooding with cheap and quick products, thinking more seriously about like privacy and other things that actually regulations ask to improve on. So maybe you could look at, description like words on like privacy in the description of the app, or like some other things that will tell us about the, quality and quantity trade-off.
Yeah, thank you. Should I? Yeah, just a quick response to that. Yeah, that's a really great comments. Actually, the apps now provide the privacy disclaimers for the consumers to know what the type of data are collected. Those can be used as a measure of that. And for the quality part, I would say, that's also related to Maggie's question. Actually, the App Store has very strong restrictions on what type of descriptions you can post. So those textual data are usually super standard, written in a plain way, and not really changing much over time. So we tried a little bit, but we don't see much time variation on that. And also, it seems that it doesn't really affect much about the quality. That's why we turn to the average ratings as a proxy for the quality. But we definitely would like to explore more how it affected the innovation patterns and how it affects the privacy concerns from that. Thank you.
Great. Then,
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much for including our paper in this fantastic conference. My name is Gong. I come from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and I'm still suffering from a lot of jet lags. So this paper is co-authored with my colleague Amber Lee and Stephen Song from CTU of Hong Kong, and also Professor Shang-Jin from Columbia University. The title of this paper is Equity Financing and Exports, Evidence from IPO Approvals in China. So IPO, or initial public offering, it refers to the events that a firm can go public and sell their shares to the public equity investors. But the first question you might have in mind is, why should we expect there is a relationship between IPO and firm exports? In fact, this idea is not unfamiliar to the practitioners in the financial industry, as many of those IPO events we see in the reality are closely associated with the firm's global expansion strategies and also their export activities. This phenomenon does not just only exist for China. We see a lot of newspaper titles in China, but also this phenomenon is well spread across the developing world and also some developed countries. And our paper tried to tackle a big picture question question is about the role of equity financing in trade. The existing trade literature has told us a lot of things about why financing is important in trade. We know that financial institutions play an important role in shaping the comparative advantage of a country. And we also know that there has been a lot of evidence, empirical evidence suggesting that financing such as bank loans or trade credits has important impact on the firm's trade patterns. But yet, all those previous studies, most of those previous studies has been implicitly focusing on debt financing, or they just overlook the different forms of financing. But we might expect that equity financing may have a distinct but yet significant effect on firm exports. So why do we think equity financing might be different? Here, I'm directly citing from the seminal work by Brown, Fazari, and Peterson in 2009. They argue that information problems, skewed and highly uncertain returns, and lack of collateral value likely made debt a poor substitute for equity finance. So their argument is initially applying to innovation, but you can imagine that when firms try to export to a new foreign country, they have to involve much in innovation, product customization, and marketing, and maybe building up like foreign sales networks. All those kind of activities are also closely related with those kind of problems. This is why we try to study the role of equity financing. We try to fill this gap in the literature, and also answering this question deliver very important policy implications, especially for a lot of developing countries, because they have underdeveloped equity market, which may also restrict the ability of their exporters to penetrate into the foreign market. And our paper tries to answer a very simple question: how does IPO affect firm exports? But in order to answer this question, we face a very severe empirical challenge. That is, IPOs are endogenous choices made by firms, and firms choose to go public only at their certain life cycle stages. Because of this, we cannot simply compare an IPO firm versus a private firm, because although those two kind of firms may appear similar in their observables, they can be fundamentally different because of this argument. We try to address this endogenous challenge by exploiting the approval-based IPO system in China. This system is fundamentally different from the so-called registration-based IPO system widely adopted by the United States and many other European countries. And for this system, if a firm wants to go public, it has to experience a very lengthy, costly, and also highly uncertain application process. They have to undergo a very strict pre-screening procedure in which they will raise very demanding hard and soft requirements. If an applicant can finally survive the pre-screening procedure, they will finally made to the so-called IPO review meeting as the last step of the application process. Select members from an examination committee, they will basically vote on whether an IPO application will be approved or not. But this institutional setup help us to address the endogeneity concerns I just mentioned, because now we can restrict our attention to those firms who apply for an IPO, who take this great efforts applying for IPO, who survive the pre-screening process and finally make to the IPO review meetings. So that we can use what we call a cohort-based difference in differences strategy, in which we can compare the successful and unsuccessful first-time IPO applicants who basically attend the review meetings in the same year. This research design conceptually is similar to the Greenstone, Hombeck, and the Moratti's $1 million plan paper. We're basically comparing those firms who passes the approval meetings versus those firms who barely failed. And this, by restricting our attention to, by using this comparison, we can address the biases from the firm self-selection into IPOs. But there is a remaining empirical challenge. That is, maybe the committee is able to pick up the firms with better unobserved quality. If that is the case, our empirical strategy can still suffer from the positive selection problems due to the committee's decisions. And in order to address that, we exploit the review meeting records and we identify a certain type of rejections. We call them fundamental related rejections. Those rejections are made because the committee thinks that the firms are facing higher future revenue or profitability risks. And we try to argue that after excluding such rejections, the remaining rejections are unlikely to bring this severe positive selection bias. And this can help us mitigate the selection biases from IPO approvals. So after adopting this empirical strategy, we can finally talk about how IPO may affect firm exports. We find that indeed, IPO has a significant effect on firm exports. The exports of successful applicants increased by about 40% in the subsequent 6 years after their IPO review meetings compared to the unsuccessful ones. And these results are largely unchanged after excluding the fundamental related rejections, which means that the results are unlikely to be driven by the positive selection by the committee. Furthermore, in terms of the margins of export growth, we find that effect is primarily driven by the extensive margins rather than the intensive margins. In other words, we find that the successful applicants significantly increase their numbers of destination product markets. But at the same time, the average exports per market remains largely unchanged. This result is very different from the prior studies on debt financing. The seminal work by Paravicini, etc. in 2015, they study the firm's access to bank credit, and they find that firms' access to bank credit mainly affects the intensive margin instead of the extensive margin. And here we find the opposite. And lastly, what might be the channels that IPO can affect firm exports? We try to argue that IPOs are just more than simply capital raising. They provide the crucial risk capital for intangible investment and risk-taking activities, which are very important when firms try to explore new export markets. And we provide a list of empirical evidence consistent with this notion. Yes, please. Yeah.
So should I think about IPOs making firms more export intensive in the sense that somehow exports react more than domestic sales? Like given those channels, it seems like they could also be applied to domestic sales, or just firm becoming bigger overall and as a result also exporting to more places and more markets.
Yes, that's a very good question. Thanks so much. So what we find here is that we also see a significant increase in the firm's domestic sales. It's not like saying the firms are disproportionately increase their export activities. But I guess like one remedy here is like, in the context of China, actually, the Chinese firms also face a lot of trade barriers when they try to sell their products to another province. There is a lot of within-country trade barriers. So you can think that a lot of our interpretations here can also apply to the domestic market. Thanks very much. So our paper contributes to the international trade literature in threefold. So firstly, our paper provides more insights about the role of equity financing in trade, which relates to the literature on the financial constraints in trade. Furthermore, our paper complements this literature on bank loans and trade finance in trade, because our paper is one of the first to looking at how equity financing may affect trade. And lastly, some of our results are also related to the literature on searching, learning, and informational frictions in international trade. Furthermore, our paper, of course, is related to the corporate finance literature on the effect of IPO and equity financing on firm performance. But our paper tried to raise a new question, and we explore a new institutional setting, and we introduce a new empirical strategy. So we are also making contribution to this strand of literature. So now let me tell you more about the IPO process in China. An IPO process in China is a multi-step process tightly regulated by the China Securities Regulatory Commission until most recently. And the system is very different from the registration system used in the US. The registration system in the US are mostly disclosure-centric, but the approval-based system is designed to select the best performing firms aligning with the policy goals of the government in addition to ensuring truthful disclosure. But the cost of implementing such a system is the IPO application process becomes much more selective, and it becomes much more uncertain and sometimes ambiguous. And it takes a lot of money and also time for the applicants to go through the process. The normal IPO application process takes about 3 years. As a first step, an applicant has to set up itself as a qualified stock share limited company and receive tutoring from the financial professionals like the investment banks in order to initiate the application process. And then they're going to go through this demanding preliminary review, which is conducted by nearly 100 CSRC staff. And this procedure involves more documentation, more corporate restructuring, and sometimes result in de facto rejections. As I mentioned previously, the hard requirements will include very high bars on the profit, on the revenue and assets of the firms. But in addition to that, there are also a lot of soft requirements which are more subjective. They include requirements on the corporate governance, the compliance, and sometimes industrial policies. And as a result of that, about 20% of firms during the preliminary review process withdrew their applications, mostly due to the pressure from the CSRC. And if the applicant can make it to a final step, it will attend a final review meeting held by the examination committee together with its underwriters. So several members from the examination committee, they will interview with the applicant, they will start this Q&A session, and lastly, they will vote. And only an applicant, if the applicant can get more than 5 votes, this case will be approved, otherwise it will be rejected. The rejection rate at this stage is about 15%. Notice that the 15% is even lower than the percentage in the pre-screening process. So we can roughly think that this like 15% of firms are those firms that are highly comparable to the past cases. And once approved, the applicant has little flexibility of choose the timing of their IPO because they have to IPO within a certain time period. And this time period is around 6 months to 1 year. And here are just some like pictures about the review meetings to give you a sense of what it looks like. So based on this institutional setup, we're going to use the Winged IPO examination bid database. This database covers the universe of IPO applications filed in the Main Board and the Gross Enterprise Market Board. Although the two boards are a little bit different in terms of the sizes of firms listed, but the IPO process are pretty much the same for the two boards. And the data covers the very detailed meeting records. It includes the date, the applicant identity, the names, the list of committee members, and also the examination outcomes. And starting from 2010, the CSRC begins to disclose the reasons and the clauses that the committee cited from the official documents to make rejections. And this information will be crucial for our identification strategy. And we manually match the names in the examination database with the Chinese Customs Trade Statistics, which contains the universe of export and import transactions. We further complement our data with the annual survey of industrial enterprises to supplement the detailed financial information of the applicants. We did several steps of sample selection. We restrict our sample to manufacturing firms. We also exclude meetings before a major stock market reform in 2006. And we also restrict or exclude the meetings just prior to the so-called IPO suspensions. Those are the events that are like, these are the events that come as like a random shock to the applicants because the government may just suddenly decide to suspend the IPO market. But if anything, those events are likely to contaminate our results. But in an extension, we also look specifically at the IPO suspensions as a natural experiment following the methodology by Teng and Howell. And although we are looking at different shocks, we still find the results consistent with our baseline findings. So our empirical strategy, like I said, is a diff in diff. The outcome variable, the primary outcome variable is the log exports of firm. And we divide this log exports into the extensive margin, which is a number of destination product markets, and the intensive margin, which is a log average exports per market. The mean regressor here is the indicator for the time gap between the current year and the IPO review meeting year for a specific firm interacted with the indicator for whether the application is passed or failed. And we further control for the firm fixed effects, and most importantly, we control for a very, very detailed revenue meeting cohort by year fixed effects. These fixed effects help us to restrict our comparison to the approved and rejected applicants attending the review meetings in the same year. So it helps us to avoid the so-called bad control problems in a standard DID staggered DID setting. And we also control for sector by year fixed effects and board by year fixed effects to control for to exclude the sector specific and board specific shocks. So now the remaining threat to our empirical strategy is IPO rejections might be indulgences made by the committee, and they might be correlated with the unobserved firm characteristics. For example, if an applicant receives a negative productivity shock in the future, and as econometricians, we don't see it, but maybe the committee member has some way to see it, then it might be the case that the committee member will just make a rejection for that. If that's the case, then our estimates might have a positive bias. So our solution is that we try to exclude the rejections citing a certain type of clauses we call revenue or profitability related clauses. Oh, yes, please. Yeah, so I think this is required by the CSRC. They require the committee members to provide the explicit reasons why they are going to reject this application. And for the reasons is like a textual data, but for each of those reasons, they have to map that to a certain clause. And that's kind of like the information we're using. Yes. Thanks. And why do we think that excluding those type of rejections can help to mitigate the problem? So those rejections are actually most commonly cited rejections. They account for about like 40% to 50% of the total rejections. Those map to the government official document of clause 37 for the main board and clause 14 for the GEM board. They refers to the factors that potentially affect the future revenue or profitability of the applicant, and they're mostly inferred based on the financial statements of the applicants. As an example, maybe the committee look at the financial statements of the firm in the past. Although the firm has fulfilled all the hard requirements on the revenue or profitability, it might still be the case that the committee sees a downward trend in the revenue, or they see that some components in the revenue or profit are not sustainable in the future. If that's the case, then the committee might make a rejection decision and citing those clauses. And if those factors are rightly assessed, then they might directly affect the export performance. And this is why we think we should exclude those kind of clauses. But what about the remaining clauses? The other commonly cited clauses are about independence, internal control, and feasibility. Independence means that the firm has transactions or competition relationship with related parties. Internal control mostly refers to the internal organization issues, or it refers to the compliance issues of the firm. And feasibility refers to the problems about whether the firm can use the fund raised from IPOs efficiently in the future. And those kind of clauses, as you can see, they cannot be inferred directly from financial statements. And most of the time, they're subjectively assessed by the committee. Furthermore, from a lot of anecdotal evidence we see from the reports and also newspaper articles, the CSRC has limited monitoring capacity over those factors. And lastly, most of those factors are domestic, and they're not directly related to the fundamentals. And this is why we think rejections based on these other factors may serve as a better control group. So to put everything formalized, our identification assumption consists two parts. Firstly, we assume that the rejection decisions based on the other clauses are uncorrelated with the observed and unobserved factors that directly affect firms' future exports. And secondly, approved firms and firms rejected for other clauses would exhibit parallel trends in export outcomes in the absence of IPO approvals. The second is the standard parallel trend assumption. And to assess the first assumption, we're conducting a balanced test in which the dependent variable will be whether an IPO application is approved or not, and we regress that on a list of ex-ante characteristics of the applicants. If we only care about the export-related characteristics, we see that there is basically no correlation between the export characteristics and the IPO application outcome. So we're not worried too much about that here. But if we also include the financial variables in addition, we do see that the firms with larger IPO size, with larger sales and also higher profit margins are more likely to be approved. And this is evidence consistent with our interpretation that there might be a positive selection issue by the committee members, by the committee's decision. But if we use the restrict sample and we exclude the rejections based on the fundamental related clauses, we see that all those positive correlations are gone. And now the p-value of the joint test is also above 10%. So it is indeed possible that our identification strategy can mitigate these positive selection problems. And for the second assumption, I will directly show you the event study plots. So here, as you can see, for both the full sample and the restricted sample, before the IPO review meetings, we see that the approved firms and reject firms shows like similar trends in terms of their log exports. But after the IPO review meetings, we do see that there is an increasing difference in terms of log exports of the successful applicants as compared to the unsuccessful applicants. Furthermore, if we divide this log exports into the extensive margin and intensive margin, now if we're looking at the log number of destination product markets, we see that this IPO effect is even more pronounced. The successful applicants shows a higher number of markets starting from year 1, and this difference enlarged until year 6. On the contrary, if we look at the intensive margin of exports, we see that the average exports per market remains largely constant over the years. And you might be worrying that maybe it is because this finding maybe is because the reallocation of export activities to the core competences of the firms, or it might be due to the fact that, you know, the firms are entering new markets and with like a very small export volume. That's something we call export experimentation. And then this might smooth out the increase in the exports to the existing markets. But we test whether the IPOs has effect on the average value of incumbent markets and also like the exports to the top market. And we see that the effects is also like missing. So basically, there is no such like intensive margin adjustments for these successful applicants. And putting all those together, we can estimate a very simple DID regression to give you some sense about how large the effect is. Basically, the IPO increases the exports of the firms by about 37% in terms of the log percentage. And also like the number of destination product markets is increased by about 30%. But for the intensive margin, those intensive margin adjustments are small in magnitude and also statistically insignificant. Furthermore, we use more granular firm destination product level data and run the regression to control for the destination product market specific shocks. The major takeaway from this table is we find that the extensive margin adjustments of the firms are mainly driven by the fact that firms are entering into new destination product markets. And we conduct a list of robustness checks and extensions. I would be really happy to talk about them here, but due to the limitation of time, I might just skip it. But if you're interested, we can talk about that later. So the remaining question is, how do IPO approvals affect exporters' activities? Why do we think IPOs or equity financing raised from IPOs might be different from debt financing? So we have two competing hypotheses here. The first story is IPO is just purely capital raising. It provides alternatives of debt financing that enable firms to raise more capital. If that is the case, we should expect that IPOs has a stronger effect on firms with less liquidity, and also it should have stronger effects for capital-intensive activities for the exporters. But a competing story is that IPO may not just be capital raising, it might also lead to compositional shifts. Specifically, it might be the case that IPO provides the risk capital that cannot be otherwise raised through debt financing. So what are the activities that depends on those risk capital instead of ordinary debt financing? Those are the activities associated with more intangible investments and the activities activities that involves more risks. And there might also be a lot of like non-financing channels, such as information disclosure and certification, or like changes in corporate governance. But those are a little bit out of scope of our study, so we will leave that for future research. So the first exercise we conduct here is we separate the firms. We conduct a subsample analysis. We separate the firms based on their ex-ante firm characteristics. The takeaway from those coefficients, I'm showing those coefficients in bars. The first takeaway is that when we divide the firms by their leverage and by their liquidity, we find that the effect is more significant, is more concentrated on the firms that are less liquidity constrained. They're concentrated for the firms with lower financial leverage and for the firms with higher liquidity. And this goes against our hypothesis about a simple capital raising story, because the capital raising story actually predicts the opposite. And we also divide the firms by their ex-ante physical capital investment intensity and their ex-ante innovation and selling expenses. So here, if we are looking at physical capital investment, we see that the effect is actually very similar across the two groups. Surprisingly, they're not significant. Both of them are not significant, but there is no difference in terms that, the IPOs do not have a larger impact on the firms who ex-ante spend more on the physical investment. But we do find that the effect is more significant for firms with ex-ante innovation and for firms with ex-ante higher selling expenses percentage. So those are corresponding to the intangible investment channel. We're talking about firms' investment into technology and sometimes into marketing. And lastly, we do find that the effect is also stronger for the less experienced exporters. So the second exercise is we look explicitly into the extensive margin adjustments. We look at the market expansion activities divided by product market characteristics, and we use the Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood to run those regressions. So what we find here is, again, we find that the market expansion, there is a more significant market expansion happening in the less capital intensive industries. Again, it goes against this capital raising story. But we do find that effect is more significant for the R&D intensive industries and advertising intensive industries. And lastly, we do find the effect is stronger for differentiated products and more complex products. And those products normally involve more product customization and more marketing activities when firms try to penetrate into the foreign market. But one limitation of this study, of this exercise we have to admit here is, here, when I'm referring to those coefficients, I'm only talking about, whether they're larger in magnitude comparing to the other group, or whether they are like more statistically significant. But when we go to the difference in those coefficients, actually most of those differences are not statistically significant. I think this is because the measurement problems in terms of that we cannot perfectly separate the different markets by those characteristics because there is a lot of measurement errors. Yes, please.
Can I ask you something? So as opposed to looking at the ex-ante differences, couldn't you just look at what kind of investment firms made after the IPO?
Yeah, 2 slides later. Yeah, thanks so much. And lastly, we also look at market expansion activities divided by the destination product market characteristics. In order to do that, we use the Comtrade data to infer the volatility of Chinese exporters to the given destination product markets. We also infer the import share of Chinese imports in a given destination product market. And what we find here is, we find that the IPO effect is stronger for the market expansions in the markets with high volatility and low Chinese import shares. It means that the IPO encourages those successful applicants to explore the high-risky markets and the markets that normal Chinese exporters are not familiar with. And to answer your question, lastly, we use the industrial the annual survey of industrial enterprises so that we also know the other outcomes of those firms. But I have to admit that there are some data caveats here. But despite that, we see that these results are pretty much consistent with our hypothesis. First of all, we do see that IPO drives firm size growth and also changes in capital structure. We see that the overall sales of firms increases, and also there is an increase in the total assets of the firms, together with a decrease in leverage, which means that there is a change in the capital structure, and firms, the exporters, are now relying more on the equity financing instead of debt financing. But more interestingly, we also look explicitly at the intangible and risky investment. We find that there is an increase in the selling expenses and also an increase in the patents per worker for the successful applicants. In contrast, when we look at the physical investment intensity, we don't find a significant result. Yes, please.
Information on who actually buys the shares?
Sorry?
Once the firm goes public, you have information on who is owning those shares?
Who are owning those shares?
Like Chinese people, or we kind of...
Mostly Chinese investors, but there might be a difference between institutional investors and individual investors.
That would be maybe an interesting information to see mechanisms.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much. So putting all those together, what we learned from this empirical exercise is, firstly, IPO are more than just simply capital raising for exporters. And secondly, IPO likely to provide the risk capital for intangible investments and risk-taking activities. And we might also see other possible non-financing channels. For example, we see there is a stronger effect on less experienced exporters that might be related to the mitigation of reputational frictions that those exporters go to, when those exporters try to go to the new market. And we also see there are positive effects on management expenses that might be correlated with some changes in the corporate governance. But we don't examine those non-finance channels specifically, and we will leave that for future studies. In the end of the day, in our appendix, we also conduct a textual analysis using natural language processing tools. And one finding from the textual analysis, we're using the textual analysis on the IPO prospectuses of those applicants. And one takeaway from the textual analysis is that we find that when firms are going to discuss about foreign market expansions, they are more likely to discuss about their marketing efforts and also building up foreign sales networks. And that is partially consistent with our finding about this intangible investment channels. So let me conclude. How much time do you have left? Oh, sorry, I go too fast. I should introduce more details about this. Sorry about that. Yeah. So our paper, the main takeaway from our paper is we provide the novel empirical evidence on IPO can promote firm exports. And they promote firm exports mostly through the extensive margins rather than the intensive margins, which makes our interpretation of this effect different from the effect of access to bank loans. Furthermore, we also our paper also our empirical evidence is also consistent with the notion that IPOs are not purely capital raising, but compositional shifts towards risk capital. In the end, our paper delivers rich policy implications. Our paper highlights the role of public equity market in facilitating foreign expansions of the leading exporters. And this is extremely important under the context of developing countries. Secondly, because China is now undergoing a stock market reform, they're actually switching from the approval-based system to the registration-based system as implemented in the US. Our paper also shine light on what is the best way to coordinate the industrial policies of the country together with the financial market reforms. So that is this paper. Thanks very much, and look forward to the insightful discussion by Jay Bing, and also thanks for all the comments and suggestions from the audience. Thank you very much.
I'm trying to look. Yeah, you are.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much for having me to discuss this very interesting paper. And I'm very amazed at your time management. After usually these days, we tend to be 10 or 20 minutes past, but we are ahead of it, so it's great. So just to quickly summarize the paper, so this is a new addition to the finance and trade literature. But what makes this paper different from the previous studies in the literature is that this paper focuses on the equity financing as opposed to the debt financing that most papers did. And also this paper is building on the very novel methodological approach with a very unique data set. And from this setting, the authors found that after IPO, export increased by around 40% in the subsequent 6 years, which is a very huge effect. And this turns out to be mainly via extensive margins, especially toward the frontier market. And the main channel through which IPO promote export is through this intangible investment and risk-taking activities. So I want to emphasize how relevant this paper is in today's world, which is also known as the post-liberation day. I'm pretty sure that most of you been working on these tariff-related issues, whether on research papers or writing a blog or policy memos or even teaching in the class, right? So the key questions in today's world is what will be the growth impact of this declining import in response to tariffs, and also what will be the potential inflationary effect. And I want to emphasize that the first thing that we need to figure out to answer these questions is whether the importers' firms can finance tariffs, right? So it depends on their financing ability and capabilities. Only importers with stronger balance sheets will be able to pay for tariffs. And once they pay for tariffs, then they can decide how much to be passed through to the consumers. And if they can squeeze their margins, then there will be limit pass-through. But if not, then there will be a higher pass-through to consumers. And same is true for the exporter side. If they have a stronger balance sheet, they may be able to share some of the tariff burdens by extending better financing terms to the importers so that they can continue importing, which will minimize the impact of tariffs. So in that sense, I want to stress again, it is very important topic to talk about this finance and trade, even in today's world. And main strength of this paper is this novel approach thanks to this very unique data set. And once upon a time, we used to be able to publish a paper in a relatively decent journal on this topic by just running panel regression with IPO dummies and post dummies, and we are done. And still, we could say that, oh, we wrote a paper on that, but those good old days are gone. And now we need to do much more rigorous empirical designs, and we have to worry about this staggered difference in difference and more selection biases. But this paper is really great is that they can observe these rejected firms. And so they can basically address the selection biases. So they are basically the same categories of the firms who applied for IPOs for some reasons now. And also they even have these reasons for rejections such that they can exclude some of the firms that could have been rejected due to some performance issues which will affect their future export activities. So in that sense, they have a very almost ideal empirical settings with this very novel data set. So all these things are good, and I can talk more about many good parts of the paper, but just given the time constraint, let me just share a couple of potential concerns, and let me propose some alternative strategies. And first question is about the data, and they have very good comparison groups for these IPO firms. But what makes me wonder is what will be left in variation in them. So what will make them to be successful versus unsuccessful firms, given these some other clauses that he went through. And Orhan actually asked one question, right? Whether there is a truthful reporting is ensured. And just one example that I had in mind was whether party membership could be a factor, right? And of course, they may not explicitly say that, oh, because this is a party member, they are successful. They cannot say that. There could be some codified statement, maybe unethical, I don't know what that means, but it could be the reason. So if that is the case, because the membership or more broadly political connections could be explaining potential access to debt financing or subsidies and many other kinds of benefit that can positively affect exporting. In that case, it may not be IPO per se, but it could be more about these political connections that is promoting and driving the export performance afterward. So that is one kind of concern that I have. So they may want to provide more robustness checks along these lines. And second thing is that this is one example of the heterogeneity analysis that they conducted to find out potential channels, right? Which is a good strategy. But one concern that I had is that most of this comparison tends to be, their confidence intervals tend to be overlapping each other. So I was wondering whether they can be tested to see whether they are statistically different or not. So because of that, I had a little bit of the reservation on the second part of the paper on these potential channels. And again, going back to the potential channels, and I found the explanation logical and reasonable, but because of that, the same reason, heterogeneity analysis is not very clear. So that is one thing. And even if I bought all the ideas and results here, one question that remains is that whether, then if that is the case, should it be a paper about IPO and exporting, or should it be a paper about IPO and innovation or R&D or something like that? So, and then it goes back to the earlier question, whether it's just the exporting or it could be domestic sales as well, right? So after IPO, they did more intangible investment, R&D and innovation, which made the firm in general better firms, which and the byproduct of that will be exporting, domestic sales, and productivity, and many other things, right? In that case, exporting will be just a subset of the byproduct. And in that case, you may want to reframe the paper toward IPO and innovation and show exporting as just one piece of the result. But I wouldn't encourage going into that way, because investment intangible and this literature is very crowded, and also they have a very intense requirement for even for measurement issues, right? That is the thing. And also one of the co-authors of the paper, Shang-Jin, has a paper about this transaction of the patent, right? So the result that you showed here, that after IPO they have a more patent per worker, something like that. It could be that they raised capital and cash from the IPO, and they used the money to buy the patent. In that case, it's not intangible investment, but it's more like just transactions of the patent using the cash. And also in terms of time framing, usually this intangible investment and risky investment tends to take in the early stages of the firm. And once this investment is materialized such that some of the patent and some fruits are reaped, then they start going into public, right? In that case, what you observe after IPO could be the result of the early stage investment, and then it'll be a little bit harder to link directly to the IPO and investment. So all that said, so my suggestion to the authors and Robin is that you may want to explore the very basic trade finance aspect more, such that you can make it more finance and trade paper. And here the idea is that these exporters can use the cash from the IPO to offer better financing terms to foreign importers. By doing so, they can increase their export, but at the same time, they don't have to raise more debt financing for export financing, right? So that's one channel, and also they can extend trade credit to new foreign importers. Usually the exporters, they don't want to offer trade credit to new foreign importers because they cannot trust them. So they start with some advanced payments and then they switch to trade credit. But if these exporters have more stronger balance sheet and better cash flow, they may put a riskier bet to the foreign importers. So they offer a better trade credit, which will improve their exporting activity. That's one channel. And you can test this idea using the data set, using some debt financing aspect as well. And same is true for importer side. And here I want to stress the fact that these exporters, Chinese exporters will be also importers at the same time, many of them. And you do have import data, right? And here the idea is that as an importer, now I want to import product from foreign exporters. And as was the case for exporting side, then foreign exporters may be able to offer you better financing terms in trade credit, for example. And that will be done only after being listed. Once you are listed, then you have a higher credit worthiness, and then the trading partners can provide better trade credit. And that's exactly the case what export credit agencies abroad does. So when foreign exporters export to foreign importers, their export credit agencies tend to provide export credit insurance when the counterpart credit worthiness is above certain bars. And this IPO can actually help these importers cross that threshold levels. In that case, that will be is particularly relevant for importing from frontier market, and because they are importers at the same time exporters, this will be the circular stuff going on, so they can expand their trading partners there, and they can improve their credit worthiness, and then they can start exporting even better and more to those firms. And this is exactly what you can try with your import side information. So there is some suggestions that I want to make. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. This was really interesting. I have two short questions. First is just given how extensive this process is for China relative to other IPO markets, one might be interested just to try to measure the costs of the firm and going through this process, and comparing that to what it would look like in other IPO markets, just to kind of get a sense of the cost-benefit ratio for firms going through this. And then second, I was trying to think about whether there was some kind of some information, that these firms were going through the process and advising and contacts that would lend them better access to foreign markets. But if that were true, then those that were rejected would have also gotten these benefits, and you wouldn't see your gap that you obviously highlight. But then it got me thinking that is it not just that there's a negative reputational damage to those that were rejected? And you could imagine, based on what Jabin was saying, that there's given political implications there, that if you were rejected, that has a black mark on you as a firm. And actually, it's more about those that were rejected than those that actually went through with the IPO.
Thank you.
Aaron's second point is actually very overlaps a lot of a thought that I have, which is that, if you are rejected, right, after having made it past the first round and then you get rejected as sort of the last hurdle, it may send us some of a signal, right, that, there's something, unobserved previously that, the regulators have spotted. And I'm just wondering if you could check with other outcome variables other than exporting, whether, these companies then subsequently do worse, even for example, on domestic sales. That might help you to check to see if this kind of a black mark story might be at play. The other suggestion I have is more of a clarifying question, which is, do these regulators actually have in mind, or is there any evidence to suggest that one of the implicit criterion that they have for approving the IPO might be something to grow the international presence of these firms, or to grow the global arm of Chinese business, right? Because if that's the case, then what you could be estimating is not so much the impact of IPOs on exporting per se, but you could actually be estimating some notion of implicit Chinese policy to promote exports by granting some firms greater access to capital. So it's kind of a little bit of a nuanced interpretation of what you might be estimating.
We want to maybe respond to JP and this question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for firstly for JB's comments. I think a lot of those comments are very valid. For example, like we do have to admit that this heterogeneity test might not be that convincing because like for this like difference in the coefficients, we do see like many of them are not that statistically significant. But another thing I want to, maybe I will just stay at this slide to answer many questions you have just raised. So one thing about political connection, we didn't have the information on the party membership of the CEO, but we do have the political we do have like check the political connections explicitly via two methods. Firstly, we look at whether those approved IPO cases, the IPO applicants get like tax exemptions, for example, or more government subsidies. And this is because like it is possible that local governments want to provide more support for those public firms because they want to create more employment at the local economy. But for that part, we didn't find a very strong effect. Another thing is that you might think that those applicants might have political connections in some specific ways. For example, they might hiring auditors, and those auditing firms may have partners also serving as a committee in the examination committee. If that's the case, then we might think that those kind of firms might be politically connected. But after excluding those connected auditors, we still find a very strong effect, which suggests that our results are unlikely to be driven by such political connections. But we do have to think about other forms of political connections because there are many other possibilities, and we should have a more comprehensive analysis on that. And in response to Aaron and Davin's question about this, like like a possible negative reputational challenge for the failed cases, we do have a very specific task here. We do a nearest neighborhood matching of each IPO case with the non-IPO firms. And after doing that, we have very interesting results here. Is that basically you can see this is basically we do this pairwise comparison of the approved cases with a very similar ex-ante similar non-IPO firm. We do see that for the approved firms, they have a very large increase in terms of their exports. But for the rejected firms, when we compare that to the most similar non-IPO firm, we see that this effect is a little bit strong in the first year, but it starts to start to fade out in the subsequent years. It means that basically those rejected firms, they are performing similarly to those non-IPO firms, although we might face more endogeneity problems here, but it suggests that, but at least we don't find evidence that they're performing worse, which means that maybe like this, like a negative reputation damage is not like the story that it drives our main results here. Also, like I have to admit that, for the second question of Davin, it is indeed true that sometimes those IPO approval decisions are due to like some industrial policy concerns, and they might definitely relate it to this like, export-driven story. But one remedy for that is we also have this industry by ear fix effect. And normally those industrial policies are implemented at the industry level. So that's kind of like, one thing